Case 1. The Mammone Family Murders, Canton, Ohio. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by muffled cries that quickly faded into the darkness. It was just after 2 in the morning on June 8, 2009, in Canton, Ohio. 5-year-old Macy Mammone and her little brother, 3-year-old James IV, were strapped into their car seats, still wearing their pajamas. They should have been asleep, safe, and dreaming. Instead, their father, 35-year-old James Mammone III, stood outside the car, his mind consumed by vengeance. Hours earlier, he had sent a barrage of angry messages to his ex-wife, Marcia Eakin. 15 hours of rage, threats, and accusations. When the messages stopped, he walked to the back seat of his vehicle, pulled out a knife, and took the lives of his own children. Prosecutors would later call it an act of calculated revenge, the ultimate punishment for a woman who chose to leave him. Macy and James were the heart of 2 families that had already endured too much turmoil. Their parents' marriage had crumbled after years of volatility. Marcia had tried to shield her children from the arguments, the anger, and the unpredictable man she once loved. In April 2009, just weeks before the murders, the divorce was finalized. The court granted Mammone visitation rights, believing that even a fractured family deserved a father's presence. No one imagined that those visits would end in bloodshed. Behind his calm facade, Mammone was unraveling, obsessed with control, humiliated by rejection, and determined to make Marcia feel the same pain he felt. His rage wasn't sudden. It had been building for years, slowly feeding on bitterness and entitlement until it became something monstrous. The last day of Macy and James's lives began like any other visitation. Mammone picked them up from their grandmother, Margaret Eakin's home. The children climbed into their car seats, unaware that they were being driven toward tragedy. As the evening wore on, Marcia grew uneasy. The tone of Mammone's text messages changed from pleading to threatening. He told her she would learn what it feels like to lose everything. At 10:30 p.m., frightened, she called 911 and told police she feared for her children's safety. By the time officers arrived at his residence, the nightmare had already unfolded. Macy and James were gone, their small bodies left in the car. But Mammone wasn't finished. He drove to the home of Margaret Eakin, the woman who had helped raise the children, the one person Marcia trusted most. He broke into her house, shot her, beat her, and shot her again. It was a methodical, hate-driven execution, a final attempt to erase every bond of love his family had left. When investigators arrived, the scene was unbearable. In the car sat 2 lifeless children, still buckled in, surrounded by the quiet aftermath of unimaginable violence. Inside the house, Margaret's body lay motionless. Detectives traced every step of Mammone's movements that night. What they uncovered told the story of a man who planned each act of destruction. He left behind a confession letter addressed to the local newspaper. He wrote of betrayal, of anger, of making Marcia pay. It was a confession without remorse, a roadmap of revenge written in his own hand. When police confronted him at his home, he surrendered without a fight. His face was calm, his voice was steady. There were no tears, no guilt, only the cold indifference of a man who believed he had won. The trial began in 2010 in Stark County Common Pleas Court under Judge V. Lee Sinclair. Prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence: his text messages, the confession letter, the weapons, and the timeline of events that painted a portrait of premeditated evil. They told jurors this was not the act of a man who snapped, but of one who calculated every moment to inflict the deepest possible wound. The defense tried to argue emotional breakdown, but nothing could explain the deliberate cruelty. Marcia Eakin sat in the courtroom, forced to relive the hours when she begged authorities to find her children. Her testimony was quiet but devastating. She described the messages, the fear, and the moment she realized her children were never coming home. The jury listened as prosecutors described how Macy's small hand was still curled around her seatbelt when she was found. It was a detail that would haunt the courtroom forever. On January 12, 2010, the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts of aggravated murder. The jury recommended death, and Judge Sinclair agreed. Mammone received 3 death sentences, 1 for each life he took, plus 27 additional years for his other crimes. The courtroom erupted in tears. For Marcia, there was no victory, only the hollow justice of knowing her children's killer would never walk free. In 2014, the Ohio Supreme Court upheld his conviction and his death sentences, calling the murders among the most calculated and remorseless acts of domestic revenge the state had ever seen. Mammone remains on Ohio's death row. His execution stayed as federal appeals continue. The case of James Mammone III stands as one of the darkest chapters in Ohio's history, a haunting reminder of how domestic violence can escalate into complete annihilation. It is a story not just of murder, but of control, of how anger can consume reason and destroy everything in its path. Macy and James IV are remembered not as victims of their father's rage, but as 2 innocent children whose lives were stolen in a moment of unspeakable cruelty. Their story forces the question that echoes in every custody court and family law hearing across America. How many warnings must be ignored before tragedy strikes? When love turns into ownership and heartbreak turns into vengeance, even innocence isn't safe. Case 2, Kristofer Garrett and the murder of his daughter and ex-partner. The night was still, the kind of quiet that makes every sound sharper, every breath heavier. Then came the screams, short, frantic, and filled with terror, followed by silence that felt eternal. It was November 20th, 2018, in Columbus, Ohio, when police responded to a call that would later define one of the most shocking acts of betrayal the city had ever witnessed. Inside a small apartment lay 2 victims, 26-year-old Nicole Duckson and her 4-year-old daughter, Christina Duckson. The killer wasn't a stranger or a burglar. It was the child's father, Kristofer Garrett, a man who let his rage and pride overpower his love. In a single night, he transformed from a father fighting for custody into a killer who annihilated the very people he was meant to protect. Nicole and Kristofer's relationship had always been turbulent, a fragile cycle of affection, arguments, and reconciliation that eventually crumbled under the strain of control and resentment. Their daughter, Christina Duckson, was the one bright light they shared, a reason to find peace. But instead of healing their bond, the custody dispute over her ignited a war of ego and emotion. Nicole wanted safety and stability for her child. Garrett wanted control. As court hearings drew near, the thought of losing custody became unbearable for him. Every message, every court filing, every reminder that he might lose his daughter chipped away at his sanity. In those moments, he made a choice, one born not of love, but of obsession and vengeance. When investigators pieced together the hours before the killings, the picture that emerged was one of terrifying deliberation. Garrett arrived at Nicole's apartment under the pretense of talking. An argument erupted, echoing through the thin apartment walls. It wasn't about love anymore. It was about ownership. In a frenzy of anger, Garrett grabbed a knife and attacked. Nicole tried to fight, but the rage was too much, too fast, too final. Then came the unthinkable. He turned on their daughter, 4-year-old Chloe Duckson, a child whose only crime was sharing her mother's eyes. The violence that followed was swift and merciless. It was the kind of act that forever breaks the meaning of family. When Nicole failed to show up for scheduled appointments, her loved ones grew anxious. Calls went unanswered. Doors remained locked. It was a family member who discovered the horror first. Nicole and Christina Duckson lying motionless. Detectives arrived at a scene of overwhelming brutality. They quickly identified Garrett as the prime suspect. The motive was clear: rage born of control, fear, and rejection. There were no signs of forced entry, no robbery, only the deliberate destruction of 2 lives by someone they had once trusted completely. Garrett was arrested soon after. his demeanor eerily detached. He offered no apology, no remorse, only the hollow excuses of a man who had already destroyed his world. In 2019, the case went to trial in Franklin County, overseen by Judge Stephen McIntosh. The prosecution built a devastating narrative, a man so consumed by his ego that he chose annihilation over acceptance. Jurors saw photos of the victims, heard recordings of arguments, and read text exchanges that charted Garrett's descent from frustrated ex to calculating killer. They listened to testimony from Nicole's family, who spoke of her dreams for a better life and a home free from fear. Every word painted a picture of a young mother doing everything she could to protect her child from the very man who would later end both their lives. The jury deliberated for hours, but the evidence was overwhelming. In September 2019, they returned a verdict of guilty on 2 counts of aggravated murder. During sentencing, the courtroom fell silent as prosecutors described Garrett's crime as the ultimate betrayal, a father who weaponized love to destroy. The jury unanimously recommended death for the murder of 4-year-old Christina Duckson and life in prison for the murder of Nicole Duckson. Judge McIntosh accepted their recommendation, declaring that the crimes were as deliberate as they were devastating. Years later, the Ohio Supreme Court would uphold Garrett's death sentence, calling the murders the embodiment of cruelty and control. In their ruling, the justices wrote that the murder of a defenseless child by her father was one of the gravest acts imaginable. Garrett remains on death row, his appeals ongoing, his name etched in Ohio's darkest records. But beyond the legal proceedings lies a deeper truth about the power of human decisions. Every tragedy begins with a choice, a thought, a word, a moment where emotion overtakes reason. For Garrett, it began with anger and pride. For Nicole, it was the hope that love could one day heal what was already broken. In the end, those choices collided in irreversible tragedy. This case is not only about murder, it is about the fragile line between love and destruction, the way unchecked emotions can turn devotion into devastation. Every decision we make, whether born from love, greed, fear, or desire, has the power to shape our lives and the lives of those we claim to care for. A single act of anger, a single moment of weakness, can destroy years of trust, family, and love. Let this serve as a mirror and a warning. The choices we make in anger or pride never vanish. They echo through generations. Every partnership, every bond is built over time, brick by brick, memory by memory, and it can all crumble in one reckless moment. Be conscious of your thoughts, guard your emotions, and never allow fleeting anger or selfish desire to become the decision that changes everything. To every partner watching this, hug yourself, hold your loved one tighter, and choose peace over pride. Let love, the kind that forgives and uplifts, reign in your home and in your heart. Because when love leads, healing follows. When pride takes control, destruction soon finds its way in. Let this story remind us all that the power of our decisions, whether born from love or from bitterness, can build a legacy of peace or leave behind a trail of regret that no one can ever escape. Case 3. Felony murder and cruel abuse of Adam Snyder. It was a quiet afternoon in Springfield Township, Ohio, until it wasn't. October 5th, 2016. A day that began like any other ended with a tragedy that would take years for investigators to fully uncover. 8-year-old Adam Snyder, the adopted son of John and Katherine Kate Snyder, collapsed on the floor of his home. When first responders arrived, what they found was not a household accident, but the aftermath of something far darker. Adam was unresponsive, frail, and showing signs of chronic neglect. His small body was covered in bruises. His eyes were lifeless. He was rushed to the hospital, but it was already too late. Doctors determined he had suffered a massive subdural hematoma, a severe brain bleed consistent with violent trauma. Within hours, Adam was gone. What the Snyders claimed was a fall would soon unravel into one of the most disturbing cases of prolonged child abuse in Ohio's modern history. To the outside world, John and Katherine Snyder were the picture of stability, devout, respected members of their community, known for their large family of both biological and adopted children. But behind the doors of their tidy suburban home, a secret nightmare unfolded. Prosecutors would later reveal that Adam, one of their adopted children, was singled out for cruel and relentless punishment. He was isolated, denied food, and beaten for the smallest infractions. His body showed signs of starvation and trauma, his weight far below that of a healthy 8-year-old. What they presented to the world as a loving, faith-driven household was, in truth, a facade masking a regime of control and cruelty. When Adam's death was first reported, the story was treated as a possible household accident. But doctors quickly raised alarms. The severity of the brain injury, combined with the malnutrition and extensive bruising, told a different story. The Hamilton County coroner ruled the death a homicide, but it took nearly 6 years for prosecutors to bring formal charges. Detectives refused to rush the process, determined to build a case that would stand against every defense. Their investigation unearthed years of documented neglect, missed medical visits, inconsistent explanations for bruises, and testimony from others who noticed Adam's declining health. It wasn't one moment of anger that killed him. It was a pattern, a slow erosion of care that ended in violence. When John and Katherine Snyder were finally indicted in September 2022, the charges were staggering: murder, felonious assault, and multiple counts of child endangerment. Both were arrested and taken into custody. In their defense, the couple claimed that Adam had fallen out of a chair, striking his head, and that his malnutrition was due to an eating disorder. But the evidence told another story. Medical experts testified that Adam's injuries were consistent with repeated trauma, not a single fall. His body reflected months, if not years, of abuse and starvation. The trial began in November 2023 in Hamilton County Common Pleas Court before Judge Melanie Greffer. The courtroom was filled with quiet fury. The prosecution methodically presented evidence that what happened to Adam was not an accident. It was the predictable result of deliberate cruelty. They argued that the Snyders were guilty of felony murder, the unintentional killing of a child during the commission of another felony, in this case, ongoing child abuse and assault. The jury listened to heartbreaking testimony from medical professionals who described Adam's emaciated condition, his severe injuries, and the unmistakable signs of long-term neglect. Photos of the boy's condition brought tears and outrage to everyone who saw them. After weeks of testimony, the jury delivered its verdict: guilty on all major counts. Both John and Kate Snyder were convicted of felony murder, felonious assault, and multiple counts of child endangerment, with the added specification of cruel abuse or torture. In a powerful statement against parental violence and betrayal, Judge Greffer handed down consecutive sentences that reflected the gravity of their crimes. Katherine Snyder was sentenced to 31 years to life, and John Snyder to 29 years to life. The judge's words were clear. Their abuse was systemic, sadistic, and robbed a child of not just his life, but his dignity. The story of Adam Snyder is one of unimaginable betrayal. Parents who should have offered safety but instead delivered suffering. Their conviction serves as a warning that evil can hide behind the facade of family, faith, and respectability. It is also a sobering reminder of how decisions made in the shadows can destroy what was built in the light. The Snyders' choice to rule their home with fear instead of love not only ended their child's life, but shattered their family and community. Their appeal was rejected in 2025, upholding their place among Ohio's most notorious child abusers. But beyond the courtroom, this tragedy carries a universal truth about the power of our decisions. Every act of cruelty, every harsh word, every neglectful moment begins as a choice. And those choices, repeated over time, shape destinies for good or for ruin. Greed for control, hunger for dominance, or the fleeting satisfaction of anger can destroy a lifetime of trust in seconds. We are reminded that love, when replaced by pride or power, becomes dangerous. Relationships, families, and communities are fragile threads woven from everyday choices. Protect them. Don't let anger, jealousy, or the thirst for control unravel what years of compassion and care have built. Let this story be more than tragedy. Let it be a call to choose patience over punishment, understanding over pride, and love over everything else. Because every decision, no matter how small, carries the power to shape not only your life, but the lives of those who depend on you. Case 4. The torture and murder of Takoda Collins. The morning of December 13, 2019 in Dayton, Ohio, began with a 911 call that first responders would never forget. 10-year-old Takoda Collins was unresponsive when paramedics arrived, his frail body bearing the unmistakable signs of a lifetime of abuse. His skin was marred with burns, bruises, and open wounds. He was so emaciated that his small frame looked years younger than his age. In the sterile quiet of that apartment, the truth was undeniable. This wasn't an accident. It was the end of a living nightmare. Takoda's death was the final chapter in years of unimaginable torture at the hands of the two adults who should have protected him most: his father, Al Mudahan McLean, and McLean's live-in girlfriend, Amanda Hinze. What investigators would uncover in the days that followed would expose one of the most horrifying cases of child abuse in Ohio's history, a life marked not by love, but by systematic cruelty. To neighbors, the family had seemed quiet, unremarkable. No one could have imagined the evil taking place behind closed doors. But for Takoda, every day was a new layer of torment. Prosecutors later revealed that McLean and Hinze, aided by Hinze's sister Jennifer Ebert, had turned their home into a house of pain. They subjected Takoda to beatings, starvation, and a sadistic regime of control that broke his spirit long before it ended his life. He was forced to stand in painful positions for hours, denied food, and punished for the smallest perceived mistakes. He was isolated, stripped of dignity, and treated not as a child, but as an object of domination. In the words of one prosecutor, this was not discipline. This was torture, ceaseless, deliberate, unimaginable. When first responders arrived that morning, the scene stopped even seasoned officers in their tracks. Takoda's body was so frail it seemed almost weightless, covered in scars both old and new. Medical examiners determined that his cause of death was terminal drowning, an act of final punishment carried out after years of abuse. It meant his last moments were spent gasping for air, desperate for mercy that never came. As detectives pieced together the evidence, it became clear that this wasn't just a crime of violence, it was a crime of domination, control, and pure evil. The arrests came quickly. McLean, Hinze, and Ebert were all charged with aggravated murder, rape, and multiple counts of child endangerment. During questioning, none showed true remorse. The story they offered was one of excuses and denial. But the evidence was undeniable. In 2021, facing the overwhelming mountain of proof, Al Mudahan McLean pleaded guilty to aggravated murder, rape, and child endangerment. His partner Amanda Hinze and her sister Jennifer Ebert also accepted plea deals for their roles in the years-long torture. In court, the details of what Takoda endured were read aloud, each fact cutting deeper than the last. Judge Dennis Langer, who presided over the sentencing, called the crime pure evil. He told McLean, "You had every opportunity to love this child, and you chose instead to destroy him." Those words carried the weight of a community's heartbreak. Prosecutors told the court that Takoda's case stood among the worst in the nation, a haunting reminder of how cruelty can thrive in silence when no one is watching. McLean was sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 51 years. Amanda Hinze received 30 years to life, and Jennifer Ebert was sentenced to 22 years to life. Each sentence reflected not only their individual roles, but the collective horror of their actions. The conscious decision, day after day, to harm instead of heal, to punish instead of protect. Takoda's story forced Ohio to confront a painful question. How could a child endure such suffering without anyone stopping it? Reports revealed that multiple agencies had missed warning signs, calls for welfare checks, unaddressed complaints, and red flags buried in bureaucracy. Takoda's death became a rallying cry for reform, exposing cracks in the very systems meant to shield children from harm. His name now stands as a symbol of every child silenced by fear and failed by neglect. But beyond the horror lies a lesson we must not ignore. Every decision, every word, every action, every moment of silence creates ripples that shape the lives around us. For McLean, Hinze, and Ebert, their decisions were born of cruelty and control, leading to irreversible tragedy. For society, their case is a mirror reflecting what happens when empathy dies and pride, anger, and apathy take its place. To everyone watching, to every parent and partner, remember this: the power to build or destroy begins with a single choice. When love fades into anger, when care turns into control, when patience gives way to pride, families fracture, and innocent lives pay the price. Let compassion be louder than ego. Let kindness overpower cruelty. Love, real selfless love, is not weakness. It is the strength that keeps darkness at bay. Let Takoda's story live as a reminder that love must never be conditional, and that the smallest decision to care can save a life. Pride destroys, but love endures. Always choose the kind of love that heals, protects, and remembers. Case 5. The murder, doping, and concealment of baby Dylan Groves. The spring air in Scioto County, Ohio, carried the quiet hum of new life, but inside one small home, death had already taken root. It was March 10th, 2019, when 2-month-old Dylan Groves drew his final breath. His parents, Jessica and Daniel Groves, stood over him, his tiny body battered, broken, and bruised. The abuse that ended his life had not begun that day. It had been building since the moment he was born. Dylan entered this world premature and fragile, his body already tainted by the drugs coursing through his mother's veins. From that moment, he never stood a chance. In the chaos of that spring morning, after a violent argument, Dylan's skull was fractured, his ribs and legs were broken. And when his cries went silent, his parents didn't call for help. Instead, they did something no one could fathom. They wrapped their baby's lifeless body in chains and rope, carried him out to a remote field, and threw him into a 30-foot well. The darkness that swallowed him that day became a reflection of their own souls. Jessica and Daniel Groves were a married couple living on the edge of collapse. Both struggled with drug addiction, paranoia, and a toxic codependency that blurred the line between love and destruction. Dylan's short life was one of suffering. Hospital reports later showed he was born addicted, his system filled with narcotics. He was taken into state custody at birth, but despite the warnings, authorities returned him to his parents, a decision that would soon prove fatal. In those 2 months of life, medical experts would later discover Dylan endured repeated abuse. His injuries were not from a single act, but from a series of violent episodes. He was living proof of how neglect, rage, and addiction can fuse into a perfect storm of evil when left unchecked. For weeks after his death, Jessica and Daniel pretended nothing had happened. When questioned about Dylan's whereabouts, they spun a story about a babysitter who had vanished with their son. But the truth, like the child they buried, could not stay hidden forever. Investigators noticed inconsistencies and pressed harder. Eventually, Daniel Groves led detectives to a shallow field near their home. What search teams found would haunt even the most experienced among them. A well 30 feet deep, and at the bottom, the body of baby Dylan, wrapped tightly in chains and rope as if his parents had wanted to ensure their secret stayed buried. The autopsy revealed the brutality of what Dylan had endured. His skull was fractured. His ribs and legs had been broken. His body showed injuries in various stages of healing, proof of long-term abuse. His death was not an accident. It was the culmination of pain inflicted by the very people entrusted to protect him. The investigation widened beyond the Groves household. Detectives discovered that child services had received multiple warnings about the couple's instability. 2 former caseworkers were later indicted for negligence, accused of failing to act despite clear signs that Dylan's life was in danger. When Jessica and Daniel Groves were arrested, their bond, built on drugs and dysfunction, began to crack. In the courtroom, Jessica's cold demeanor turned explosive. At one point during the trial, she shouted that she was done, a brief outburst that revealed the rage still festering beneath her surface. The prosecution called her the primary aggressor, the one who inflicted most of Dylan's injuries, while Daniel was portrayed as the silent enabler, a father who stood by and watched the life drain out of his son. Their defense tried to frame their addiction as a disease, but the evidence spoke louder than excuses. The trial began in late 2019 in Scioto County Common Pleas Court, presided over by Judge Howard H. Harcha III. The jury heard the unflinching details, the injuries, the lies, the cover-up, the chains. Prosecutors argued that this was more than child abuse. It was murder, fueled by addiction and cowardice. On January 10, 2020, the verdict came down. Jessica Groves was convicted of aggravated murder, and Daniel Groves was found guilty of murder and other related charges. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as the judge delivered the sentences. Jessica Groves received life in prison without the possibility of parole, LWOP, plus 32 additional years. Daniel Groves was sentenced to 47 years to life. Their home was demolished shortly after, a physical erasure of a place that had come to represent the worst kind of betrayal. For the people of Scioto County, the murder of baby Dylan was more than a crime. It was a reckoning. The sight of rescue teams pulling that small chained bundle from a well will forever be seared into the memory of everyone who was there. It forced Ohio's child protective systems to confront their failures, to ask how a defenseless newborn was returned to parents so clearly unfit. 2 caseworkers faced criminal charges for their inaction, an acknowledgement that sometimes the system's silence can kill as surely as abuse itself. But beneath the legal proceedings and media coverage lies a deeper truth about human choices. Every tragedy like this begins with a decision. Addiction is not a justification, it's a path of choices made again and again until empathy is drowned by desperation. The Groves made one decision after another that prioritized their cravings over their child's cries until there was nothing left to protect. Their story is a brutal reminder that when love is replaced by selfishness and conscience silenced by indulgence, destruction becomes inevitable. To everyone watching, to every partner, parent, and caregiver, pause for a moment. Hug yourself, and if you have someone beside you, hold them close. Let this story remind you that every choice we make carries a ripple. A word spoken in anger, a lie told in fear, or a decision made for momentary pleasure can alter lives forever. The power of our decisions, whether born from love or greed, from care or neglect, defines who we are and who we become. Love is not weakness, it is strength. It is the daily decision to do what's right even when it's hard. Let compassion, not ego, guide your home. Let patience replace pride. Because one careless moment, one reckless choice, can undo everything that took years to build. The story of baby Dylan Groves is a reminder that innocence depends on the choices of others. And when those choices fail, the consequences echo for generations. Case 6. Aggravated murder of Bryson Brown. The morning of June 8th, 2021 began like any other on Gears Avenue in Columbus, Ohio. It was quiet, peaceful even, but behind one door that calm was an illusion. Inside, 4-year-old Bryson Brown lay unconscious, his small body battered beyond recognition. His father's live-in girlfriend, Michelle Hilyard, rushed him to the hospital, frantically claiming that Bryson had fallen while jumping on a bed. Doctors immediately knew she was lying. The child's injuries were catastrophic. Massive internal bleeding, deep bruising, and trauma that no accident could explain. Within hours, Bryson was dead. What had begun as a supposed domestic emergency was now a homicide, and Hilyard's web of deceit was beginning to unravel. Bryson was a child who loved cartoons, toy trucks, and giggling at the smallest things. He was also a child who had been caught in a home filled with tension and volatility. Hilyard, 30 years old, had taken on the role of caregiver to her boyfriend's son, but beneath the surface, her relationship with the boy had grown toxic. Investigators would later reveal that what happened that day was not sudden. It was the result of weeks, perhaps months, of escalating violence. Michelle Hilyard, who was supposed to protect Bryson, had instead become his greatest threat. She had lashed out in moments of anger, punishing him for being a child, punishing him for being loud, needy, or simply there. When first responders arrived at the hospital, Bryson was already gone. The medical examiner's findings shattered any illusion of innocence. His injuries weren't consistent with a fall. They were consistent with a beating. The trauma was so extensive that doctors immediately alerted police. Investigators arrived at the Gears Avenue home, sealing off the crime scene. They found signs of chaos, evidence of a violent altercation, and inconsistencies in Hilyard's story that pointed squarely toward deliberate abuse. Within hours, she was arrested and charged with aggravated murder and felonious assault, her bond set at $1 million. As the investigation unfolded, the truth became impossible to deny. Detectives found that Bryson had lived in a pattern of fear. Neighbors would later recall how they occasionally heard shouting, then silence. The prosecution argued that Hilyard's assault was intentional, that she inflicted the fatal blows with what they called a cruel and inhumane purpose. This was not a momentary lapse of judgment. It was the culmination of unchecked rage. Bryson's death was slow, violent, and preventable. During questioning, Hilyard continued to insist the boy's death was an accident, but the forensic evidence told a story her words could not erase. Every bruise, every fracture, every internal wound became testimony in a courtroom where the victim could no longer speak for himself. In Franklin County Common Pleas Court, prosecutors stood before Judge Stephen M. Taylor and described a child who had been beaten so severely that his small frame couldn't bear it. The jurors listened as the state painted a picture of a caregiver who had violated the ultimate human responsibility, the duty to protect a child. In June 2024, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on all major counts. The courtroom remained heavy with silence as Judge Taylor read the sentence. 25 years to life in prison for aggravated murder. The judge's words were deliberate and stern. "You were trusted to care for this child," he said. "Instead, you extinguished a life that looked to you for safety." Hilyard's expression remained blank as the reality of her punishment sank in. The sentencing marked not just the end of a trial, but the exposure of a grim truth about domestic trust. Bryson's case became a textbook example of what experts call the Cinderella effect, a phenomenon in which non-biological caregivers pose heightened risks of violence toward children left in their care. His death wasn't only the failure of one person, it reflected a broader danger that too often hides behind closed doors. Today, Michelle Hilyard sits in an Ohio state prison serving the sentence that will define the rest of her life. Bryson's name, though small in years, looms large in the conversation about domestic safety. His story stands as a painful reminder that evil doesn't always come from strangers. It can live within the very homes meant to protect. And yet, beyond the courtroom and the verdict, lies an even deeper message, one about the power of our decisions and the fragility of trust. Every act of anger, every moment of neglect is a decision. What Michelle Hilyard chose that day cannot be undone. It was a moment born from pride, frustration, and a need for control, a moment that destroyed an entire future. To everyone listening, to every parent, guardian, and partner, take a breath. Look around you. The people in your life are not burdens, they are gifts. Hug yourself and hug the ones you love. Let love be stronger than pride. Let patience replace anger. A single decision can change the course of a lifetime, for better or for worse. Choose compassion even when it's hard. Choose restraint even when you feel rage. Bryson's story should not only break our hearts, it should open our eyes. Behind every headline is a warning. Love requires intention. The power to destroy or to protect lies in the choices we make every day. May his memory remind us all that true love is not just felt, it's proven through patience, kindness, and the courage to choose peace when anger calls for war. Case 7. The Murder and Burial of Jordan Rodriguez. It was December 2017 in Cleveland, Ohio, a bitter winter that concealed the horrors buried beneath a quiet neighborhood yard. Inside a small, cluttered home, 5-year-old Jordan Rodriguez had already endured years of neglect and abuse. By the time he took his final breath, his body bore the marks of a child whose suffering had gone unseen for far too long. When he died, his mother, Larissa Rodriguez, and her boyfriend, Kristofer Rodriguez, did not call for help. Instead, in the cold, unfeeling hours that followed, they wrapped Jordan's small body in a blanket, sealed him inside a plastic tote bin, and carried him into the backyard. There, beneath a patch of frozen earth, they buried their secret, a child's body, hidden like discarded trash. The snow would come soon after, masking the grave in silence, but secrets like that never stay buried forever. Jordan was one of many children born into Larissa's chaotic world, a home plagued by instability, neglect, and dysfunction. Despite involvement from Catholic charities and multiple social service agencies, the environment inside the Rodriguez household remained dangerous. The system tried to help, but intervention came too late. Jordan was often hungry, dirty, and left alone for long hours. Behind closed doors, the abuse escalated. Prosecutors would later describe it as a pattern of unrelenting cruelty. His ribs were broken, his body bruised, his spirit crushed long before his death. And through it all, Kristofer Rodriguez, the man who shared Larissa's home and her secrets, participated in the violence. Together, they became partners in destruction, feeding off each other's neglect and cruelty until their child was gone. When Jordan's death was finally uncovered, it wasn't because of a confession, it was because of a tip. On December 19, 2017, investigators arrived at Larissa's home after reports surfaced that Jordan hadn't been seen in weeks. Larissa told police her son was staying with a family friend, but her story changed with every question. Detectives searched the property, following their instincts to the backyard. There, shovels hit something solid. Beneath the frozen ground, wrapped in layers of plastic and cloth, lay the body of 5-year-old Jordan Rodriguez. The discovery stunned the city. Cleveland had seen tragedy before, but this was different. A child buried in his own backyard by his own mother was a level of cruelty that defied understanding. The investigation that followed exposed not only the horror within that home, but also the system's devastating failures. Authorities learned that despite repeated visits and case reviews, Jordan had slipped through the cracks. His death triggered a $12 million civil lawsuit against Catholic Charities and one of its employees, accusing them of negligence for not intervening sooner. The case would later reach the appellate court, forcing Ohio to confront the question no one wanted to ask. How many warnings does it take to save a child's life? Both Larissa and Kristofer Rodriguez were arrested soon after Jordan's body was found. In interrogation rooms, their relationship fractured into blame. Larissa accused Kristofer of delivering the fatal blow. Kristofer blamed her for years of neglect and violence, but neither could escape responsibility. The evidence, Jordan's broken ribs, the concealed grave, and their conflicting lies, was irrefutable. The trials were separate, but both were unbearable. In 2018, Kristofer Rodriguez was convicted of involuntary manslaughter, felonious assault, and child endangering and sentenced to 28 years in prison. Larissa faced harsher charges, murder, felonious assault, and child endangerment, and received 15 years to life in prison. During sentencing, prosecutors called the crime a complete collapse of motherhood and humanity. The judge's words were equally severe. You buried your own child and thought the cold earth would hide what you did. But truth doesn't freeze. It waits. While the criminal convictions brought some closure, the impact of Jordan's death rippled far beyond the courtroom. It forced a painful reckoning across Ohio's child protection network. The civil suit against Catholic Charities reopened wounds years later when an appellate court ordered a new trial, acknowledging that the system's failings might have contributed to Jordan's death. His case became a symbol, a heartbreaking example of how bureaucracy, neglect, and silence can become accomplices in tragedy. But even in death, Jordan's story speaks. It tells us about the power of choices, the small, everyday decisions that build or destroy the lives around us. Larissa and Kristofer's choices were made in selfishness and apathy, born from a life of chaos and addiction. Each ignored cry, each moment of anger, each decision to look away instead of care became another stone in the grave they dug for their son. And though their sentences will last decades, the weight of what they did will never lift. For everyone watching, Jordan's story is not just about a child lost. It's about responsibility. It's about seeing the signs, about speaking up, about choosing love even when it's inconvenient. For partners and parents listening now, take this moment and reflect. The power of love is not found in perfection. It's found in patience, in awareness, and in choosing compassion over neglect every single day. The story of Jordan Rodriguez reminds us that love is an action, not a promise. It is protection, not possession. And when we fail to act with love, the consequences are irreversible. Let his story stir our conscience, to never stay silent when we see suffering, to never allow pride or indifference to take the place of care. Because when love disappears, humanity follows, and no child should ever have to pay that price. Case 8, the Pike County Rhoden Family Massacre. 8 victims. It was the early morning of April the 22nd, 2016, when Pike County, Ohio, woke to a silence so heavy it felt unnatural. Before dawn broke over the Appalachian Hills, 8 members of the Rhoden and Gilly families lay dead in 4 different homes. Each was shot multiple times, most while they slept. Mothers, fathers, brothers, and children, all executed in a single coordinated attack. Among them was 19-year-old Hannah Rhoden, found in her bed with her newborn baby lying beside her, miraculously unharmed. The massacre was ruthless, methodical, and personal. It wasn't the work of strangers or intruders. It was an inside job, a family annihilating another family. This would become the largest and most haunting mass murder in modern Ohio history. The roots of this slaughter ran deep. The Rhoden and Wagner families had once shared meals, laughter, and friendship, but their connection turned toxic through one of the most common and deadly sources of conflict, a custody dispute. Hannah Rhoden had a child with Edward Jake Wagner, the youngest son of the Wagner family. After the relationship ended, tensions grew over who would raise the little girl. What began as arguments over visitation spiraled into an obsession. The Wagners, George Billy Wagner III, his wife Angela, and their sons George IV and Jake, believed that the only way to gain full control of the child was to erase the Rhodens from existence. Over weeks, they planned the unthinkable. They bought guns, studied their targets' routines, and even purchased customized shoes designed to leave no recognizable footprints. They transformed their love for a child into a weapon of hate. When the bodies were discovered on the morning of April the 22nd, chaos consumed the small community of Piketon. Police found the victims across 4 properties, 7 adults, and 1 teenage boy, each killed execution style. The precision of the killings led investigators to suspect a professional hit. Rumors of drug cartels and gang activity spread like wildfire, but the truth, when it came, was far more chilling. The killers weren't outsiders, they were kin. The investigation that followed was the most extensive in Ohio's history. Hundreds of interviews, thousands of pieces of evidence, and years of tireless work led detectives to one family, the Wagners. The breakthrough came when Jake Wagner decided to confess. In his plea, he admitted to killing 5 of the 8 victims, including Hannah Rhoden, the mother of his child. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, Jake agreed to cooperate fully, implicating his parents and brother. His confession was horrifying in its detail. He explained how his family coordinated their attacks, moving from house to house under the cover of darkness, shooting their relatives point blank while they slept. They even brought dogs to control the crime scenes and silencers to muffle the sounds of murder. The Wagners were arrested in November 2018. All 4, Billy, Angela, Jake, and George IV, were charged with aggravated murder, conspiracy, and a long list of related felonies. Their family, once seen as hard-working members of the community, was now branded as cold-blooded killers. Each trial revealed more of the horror. Jake Wagner's 2021 testimony laid bare the twisted logic that drove the killings. A belief that by killing Hannah and her family, they could keep and control their child forever. Angela Wagner, the matriarch, confessed to helping plan the murders, manipulating her sons, and writing fake custody documents. In 2022, George Wagner became the first family member to face a full jury trial. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The following year, Jake Wagner received the same punishment, 8 life sentences, 1 for each life taken. Their mother, Angela, was sentenced in 2025 to 30 years in prison for her role in the conspiracy. Their father, Billy Wagner, still awaits trial, his case delayed repeatedly by appeals and procedural battles. Judge and prosecutors called the crimes beyond comprehension, a phrase that hardly captured the scale of evil. The Wagner's actions obliterated not only 8 lives, but an entire community's sense of safety. The victims included parents, grandparents, and teenagers, all executed because one family wanted power and control. Even now, the surviving Rhoden family members live with the scars of that night, reliving it through every hearing and appeal. For them, justice remains incomplete. The Pike County Massacre stands as a chilling testament to how obsession, pride, and possessiveness can twist love into something monstrous. It began with a decision, a choice to control rather than compromise, to dominate rather than nurture. From that single poisoned thought grew a conspiracy of murder that shattered generations. To every parent and partner watching, this case is not just a story of death. It's a mirror reflecting the dangers of unchecked emotion. Love that turns into ownership becomes a weapon. Desire for control, when mixed with pride, can become lethal. Every decision, whether made in anger, fear, or greed, carries consequences that reach far beyond what we can see. The Wagners believed they were securing their family's future. Instead, they destroyed it. Their actions remind us that every decision has a ripple effect, and when made in darkness, those ripples become waves of destruction. The story of the Rhoden family massacre is more than a record of crime. It's a haunting lesson in how human emotion, when left unchecked, can become its own weapon. Love is meant to protect, not possess. When we forget that, tragedy becomes inevitable. Choose love that heals. Choose peace that preserves. Because one decision born from pride can echo for generations, and no one, not even family, is immune to the cost. Case 9. The execution of an ex-husband in front of his children. It was the early evening of August 15, 2017, in Riverside, Ohio. The sun was setting over a quiet medical office parking lot when routine life shattered into chaos. Robert Caldwell, a 35-year-old father, was ending a day like many before it, returning his 3 children to their mother after a weekend visit. He parked, stepped out, and opened the back door of his car to help them out. Then came the gunfire. From across the lot, a man emerged from the shadows, Sterling H. Roberts, and began firing. Multiple shots. Cold, precise, merciless. The sound echoed through the lot as Robert collapsed to the ground in front of his children. They screamed for help, watching in horror as their father took his final breath. The shooter wasn't a stranger. Roberts was the boyfriend of Robert's ex-wife, Tawny Caldwell. What should have been an ordinary custody exchange had become the stage for a calculated execution, one that unfolded in front of the very children they were all fighting over. Behind the gunfire lay years of resentment and obsession. Robert and Tawny Caldwell's marriage had ended badly, their divorce giving rise to a bitter custody battle that consumed both sides. When Tawny began dating Roberts, a volatile man with a criminal past, their relationship became a crucible of anger and paranoia. Prosecutors later described the pair as partners in fixation. They convinced themselves that Robert was the enemy standing between them and control of the children. Fueled by hatred and manipulation, their twisted solution was murder. On the day of the shooting, Roberts acted with brutal precision. Witnesses recalled how he waited for Robert to arrive, ambushed him, and fled without hesitation. It was not a moment of rage. It was an orchestrated killing. The crime scene left investigators stunned by the cruelty. 3 young children standing over their father's body, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The investigation was massive and swift. Federal and state authorities soon discovered that the shooting was only the endpoint of a larger criminal web. Tawny Caldwell and Roberts had been using phones and social media to track Roberts' movements for months. They were joined by 4 co-conspirators: Tawny's mother, her stepfather, and Roberts' brothers, who helped them stalk, monitor, and ultimately corner Robert. What began as a domestic dispute had become a multi-state cyber-stalking and murder conspiracy, proving how deeply obsession can spread when family lines blur with vengeance. In March 2018, 6 people, including Roberts and Caldwell, were federally indicted. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Text messages, surveillance records, and witness statements showing that the couple meticulously plotted every step. The trial revealed the darkest side of human calculation, how love, twisted by jealousy and control, can be weaponized into cold execution. When Tawny Caldwell faced sentencing, she pled guilty to interstate stalking, resulting in death in exchange for avoiding a life sentence. She was given 35 years in federal prison. Her partner, Sterling H. Roberts, refused to plead and went to trial. The jury convicted him on all counts, and the judge, Thomas M. Rose, called the murder a cold and ruthless act committed with complete disregard for human decency. Roberts received life in federal prison in 2022, ensuring he would die behind bars. For Robert Caldwell's children, however, no verdict could restore what was taken from them. They had not only lost their father, but witnessed his final moments. The psychological wounds ran so deep, the legal proceedings revealed a tragic consequence of this trauma. Robert's son, Jacob Lee Caldwell, went missing days after witnessing the shooting. He was the subject of a massive year-long search before finally being located safe in August 2018, having been hidden away by his mother's associates. His disappearance and eventual recovery underscored the long-term, devastating psychological fallout that extends far beyond the prison walls, demonstrating how deeply a partner's crime fractures a family's safety and well-being. The story of Tawny Caldwell and Sterling Roberts stands as a devastating lesson in how love can rot into violence when pride and possession replace empathy. This was not just a murder, it was a deliberate act of emotional warfare designed to destroy Robert Caldwell in life and scar his children in memory. The couple's decision, born from obsession, jealousy, and control, turned an everyday custody battle into an execution. To anyone listening, this case is more than a headline. It's a warning. Every choice we make in anger, every grudge we feed, every toxic word we let grow can evolve into something unrecognizable. The line between control and compassion is thinner than we think. In moments of heartbreak, we must choose peace over vengeance, reason over rage. If you're a partner, a parent, or someone holding on to bitterness, pause. Hug yourself. Hug your loved ones. Remember that the decisions you make in the heat of emotion can alter every life connected to yours. Pride and revenge may feel powerful, but love, the kind that forgives and restrains, is what truly protects. Robert Caldwell's death reminds us that when love turns to control, families collapse. When anger goes unchecked, children pay the price. May his story be a mirror for every listener, urging us all to guard our hearts from the kind of darkness that can turn a parent's love into a weapon of hate. Case 10. The Knofel Conspiracy. Murder of a wife by a minor lover. It was the early morning of November 16, 2012, in Willoughby Hills, Ohio, when screams shattered the quiet darkness of the Knofel home. The sound of metal striking flesh echoed through the master bedroom, followed by silence. Lisa Knofel, a 41-year-old wife and mother, lay bleeding in her bed, stabbed multiple times with a knife taken from her own kitchen. The attacker was 18-year-old Sabrina Zunick, Lisa's foster daughter, a girl she had cared for, fed, and welcomed into her home. But the person truly responsible wasn't holding the knife. He was standing just beyond the doorway. Kevin Knofel, Lisa's husband. Kevin Knofel wore the mask of a devoted family man, a husband, a father, a provider. But beneath that calm surface was something much darker: manipulation, greed, and a hunger for control. When Sabrina entered their lives as a troubled foster teen, she was meant to find safety and stability. Instead, Kevin saw opportunity. What began as mentorship slowly turned into grooming, his false compassion evolving into seduction. He built trust only to corrupt it, turning a vulnerable girl into a weapon. The motive was as cruel as it was simple. Kevin had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on Lisa. In late-night conversations and secret text messages, he began planting the idea of murder in Sabrina's mind. He told her that once Lisa was gone, they could finally be together, and the money would set them free. What began as fantasy hardened into a plan. On that cold November night, Kevin claimed he was asleep when he heard the struggle. But when police arrived, they found Sabrina in shock, covered in blood and confessing immediately. "I did it," she said, trembling. Her words painted the scene with horrifying clarity. She had gone to Lisa's room, knife in hand, and attacked her as she slept. What she didn't admit right away, and what investigators would soon uncover, was that Kevin had orchestrated it all. Detectives quickly grew suspicious of Kevin's calm demeanor and his eagerness to label the crime a breakdown by a disturbed teen. But the truth was hidden in the hundreds of text messages exchanged between him and Sabrina, digital evidence of his psychological manipulation. In those messages, Kevin flattered her, toyed with her emotions, and pushed her toward one unthinkable act. The prosecution later described it as emotional puppetry, the deliberate turning of a confused young girl into a killer through grooming and greed. In 2013, Sabrina Zunick pleaded guilty to aggravated murder, accepting responsibility for what she had done. But in a dramatic twist, she agreed to testify against Kevin, the man who had manipulated her every step of the way. On the witness stand, Sabrina described in excruciating detail how Kevin had told her that Lisa was worth more dead than alive. Those 6 words sealed his fate. Kevin Knoefel was convicted in 2014 of aggravated murder, conspiracy, and sexual battery. Judge Joe Gibson sentenced him to life in prison with parole eligibility after 25 years, calling him a manipulative predator who turned love into a weapon. Sabrina, the teenager he'd controlled, had already been sentenced to life with parole after 30 years, a punishment 5 years longer than her manipulators. The Knoefel case remains one of Ohio's most chilling stories of domestic betrayal, a family home transformed into a crime scene through deception, lust, and greed. It revealed how emotional control can be every bit as deadly as physical violence, and how trust, once violated, can destroy lives in silence. Today, both Kevin Knoefel and Sabrina Zunick sit in Ohio prisons, bound forever by a crime that shattered an innocent family. Sabrina will wait 30 years before she can even ask for freedom, 5 years longer than the man who exploited her. The imbalance is haunting, but it also reflects how complex justice becomes when manipulation and murder intertwine. The murder of Lisa Knoefel is more than a story of greed. It's a mirror of human weakness. It shows how easily affection can be twisted into obsession, and how the smallest seeds of deception can grow into irreversible tragedy. Betrayal rarely begins with violence. It begins with a whisper, a suggestion, a lie, a manipulation that goes unchallenged until it's too late. Let Lisa's story remind us. Love should heal, not harm. It should guide, not manipulate, and when trust is placed in our hands, it becomes sacred. Protect it, choose compassion over control, truth over temptation, and awareness over denial, because one selfish decision, one whispered manipulation, can destroy an entire life. Justice was served, but the scars remain. Subscribe for more true stories of betrayal and justice. And don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts to keep their memories alive. Every voice matters in making sure these stories are never forgotten.